Hello, thanks for tuning in to the third video of our series with myself and Chris. Chris, see if I can pronounce this right. I'll get this right. Mastropietro. Mastropietro. My wife has been making me practice pronouncing everybody's last name, so hopefully I got that right. We'll check with Chris later. So before I set some context for this dialogue with Chris, some housekeeping. So given the coronavirus epidemic and that we're all pretty much quarantined, that has afforded us bringing all of the Circling Institute's offering online for the time being. And so this is the first time that we've done this. And I've done one circling event so far, and it was really quite exceptional. I wasn't sure how that would go online, but I was quite stunned at how much circling revealed herself on Zoom. So I'm stoked about what this can open up, because I've been hesitant about bringing it online for a lot of different reasons. So what that affords is for all of you who have been writing me or contacting me saying that you've been wanting to come out and do some of the circling events put on by the Circling Institute that I co-teach, but haven't been able to make it out to the Bay Area. Now you can come and play. And so I'm hopefully looking forward to meeting a lot of you that I haven't met in person yet. So I hope to see you there. The link below, if you click on the one to the Facebook page, it'll give you all the current events and how to sign up and how much it costs and all that stuff and what to do. So there's that. And then the other thing is, if you want to work one-on-one with me, email me. My email's below. And I think that's all the housekeeping for now. So I'm excited about this third video. So if you're new to the series, basically what we're doing is we are intending on going through the Platonic Dialogues, Chris and I, always us two, and we may bring on different people to come in to read through the dialogues and see how deeply we can embed ourselves inside of them and understand through them, and see the changes that come out of that endeavor in whatever way that unfolds. So this is probably the first of like 8 billion videos. So if YouTube still exists by the time we get done with the dialogues and we're still alive, I will be surprised. However, that's the infinite potential of this series. So very much it's going to be about the process, and the process so far has been really enlightening for me. This video was just it's kind of long. I'm thinking about cutting it into 2 sections, but I think I'd probably be best just to leave it as one section. But I think it's almost 2 hours. So this one is where we continue reading the article that John Vervaeke and Chris wrote on the Socratic Dialogues. And we thought that it would be useful to read that article first and walk through it. And it's quite an intense endeavor, because it shows or reveals the possibility of the Socratic way, the Platonic Dialogues, and what they unearth as probably more relevant than they've ever been. And it really does a beautiful way of unconcealing the musicality of that. And I thought it would be great, both Chris and I thought it would be great to set context, just to bring the Platonic Dialogues really relevant to our time. And I'm learning a lot from it. The first one is mostly us just kind of reading and riffing a little bit, and then the second one, the second half of the video, we really move into espousing into dialogos, and there was a very just a deep. I mean, I think both Chris and I were just having light bulbs go off and my life was making sense, and my marriage was making sense, and the whole universe was making sense in ways that I'm sure I'll be living inside of and walking with, that I'll report back to you the consequences of that walk called my life next week when we start our next video. So thank you so much for participating, and much love. You know, we were just talking. I can't. I should just start off recording, right?
We always start in the middle of a conversation that leaves only suspicions as to where it began.
Yeah. Well,
which I think is kind of fun.
It's one of the things I really like about you is we can talk about, like, we can start the conversation talking about the most ordinary thing, and then just start following the thread. and this time we ended up in, like, why is it, the question of, like, what is the difference between looking at the sense of spaciousness and instead seeing absence and void, versus spacious, and that in many spiritual traditions, like, that surrender has a lot to do with that. It's like, you kind of surrender to the void, right? And then you kind of leap off, and you're like, all right. And you exercise some capacity, and then you start free falling, and you're freaked out. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, there's a lot of room here. In fact, I've been free falling my entire, oh my God, everything still is stilling with nothingness, right? Like,
yes.
That kind of, that switch. And you were talking about, that experience of where you're, you fall into that mood or that state of restlessness, right? If you've been in the house too long, or your perspective has become really myopic, or whatever it is that induces that quality of, like, where the diffuseness of what you're unsatisfied with, you can't find the object to satisfy, right? And that sense of restlessness. And where you were talking about actually just starting to, this practice that you've been having, which is rather than trying to avoid it, right, or get out of it, just kind of surrendering to it a bit. And that there's something about that. And one of the things that I thought about, which is, it seems like what you're doing on some level, when you kind of turn toward it, right, and you welcome it, you brought up, oh yeah, then the dialogos can start. You can start to have like a dialogic, relational sense. You can find yourself and it together. And at some point, I would imagine another way of saying, when you switch over and it becomes spaciousness, is that point where you start to indwell it, and you become indwelled by it. Whereas the other experience is something like it's opaque to you in some level. You kind of bounce off of it, right? But it's not an indwelling relationship. But that sense of indwelling it. Because the difference between, whole with a W and a whole without the W, right? It's like, it's very much that I try to make that. I know there's a really good joke that I haven't been able to make funny yet about that, but there's a big difference between wholeness and wholeness.
Yes. Yeah. And the difference is separated by the thinnest of lines, and it's dependent upon some internal sacrament of consciousness is what ushers a person across that line. Yeah, we were talking about the sort of the feeling of it being inescapable, that kind of restlessness, the feeling of futility that steals upon you. That's you may as well try and outrun your shadow for all of the good it does to distract yourself away from it. And so, yeah, that the sinking into it, the indwelling, as you put it very well, becomes a way of knowing it from within. Then becomes a way of becomes a way of dialectically then working through it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So speaking of dialectically working through it, shall we? You wrote down a few words about dialectic.
Just a few.
Yeah.
Just a few. Absolutely. Yeah. I think a few too many words about dialectic.
Right.
If I'm being honest, a few too many words about dialectic. But yes. Okay. So should we pick up where we left off?
Yeah. Let me just go ahead and find it real quick. I have it right here somewhere. Here it is. Okay, so I put a link below so you can, the people who are listening can follow along with us. One of the things I actually wanted to comment, because I think I got a couple comments about like commenting on the verboseness of the language. And it's interesting because I think for me, it's the verboseness is not a function, doesn't seem like it's a function of trying to be verbose. It's really a function of kind of putting your attention on some place that is a phenomena that doesn't quite have words yet to it, or doesn't have words in the particular way that that's trying to emerge. So I think it's like what the language isn't trying to be highfalutin for its own sake. It's more like that you're now in a world that's poverty of language, right? And of course, you can't just invent words. So you have to take other words and angle them and reposition them. But if you think about it, though, it's what I get a sense of in this article, right, is this sense of there's something kind of just at the edges of intelligibility that you're trying to disclose, right? You're trying to, it's clothed in unfamiliarity, or it's clothed in not an adequate language for it yet. And so what part of what's happening here is you're watching kind of a wrestling match, right, in a certain sense of trying to unbutton existence, or that domain of existence, right, until it starts to come out again. And that to me very much mirrors the process of the dialogos that we're talking about, right? So it's like what it took, I think. I'm just imagining you and John sitting there and talking about all this stuff, right? And
yeah, and I mean, and you're right. Struggling with what you say is very considerate, and you're right, because there's no attempt here to be garrulous for its own sake, and verbosity is not a virtue unto itself. I get that, and I've had that conversation with people before, where if the nomenclature seems very technical or dense, then it's somehow trying to obfuscate something. And it's not, it's quite the opposite. But the challenge is that when you're trying to, the semiosis of language and the way that we're using it is a container for things that aren't bounded linguistically. Yeah. That's just the nature of the problem, So when you're trying to use language to constrain and contain that which is not, it is inerrable. you have a creative as well as an intellectual exercise cut out for you.
Yeah.
That's very demanding.
Yeah.
So no, there's no, this isn't being loquacious for its own sake, and there's no attempt to try and be, to try and brandish this as a, as some kind of, rhetorical, as some kind of rhetorical maze, except insofar as it was our maze that we were finding our way through. Yeah. So if you're trying to find your way through it and finding it difficult, it's because we too were finding our way through it and finding it difficult. And the idea that such things should be easy and straightforward, or that they should be digestible in short order, is just a premise that I reject. Yeah. I read a lot of things that seem oblique to me, and that I have to struggle and wrestle with. I mean, my goodness, you're a Heideggerian guy. You know this better than most, that sometimes the struggle is what avails the insight, right? That's the whole point of the dialectical process, which is why there's an attempt. There's both a voluntary and involuntary attempt to exemplify the very process of the dialectic, which is to say that it's a process that fights back, right? It's a process that fights back. Yeah. It's not tamed, and the attempt to tame it, the attempt to tame and contain it, as I've said, ends up resulting in something that bears the marks of the wrestling match that produced it. Yeah. Right? The fingerprints of that the grip marks are all over it, because that's reflective of the exercise it took to conceive of it. Yeah. And so I think I want to emphasize that, like, when it comes to doing this kind of work, and goodness knows I'm no expert, and incidentally no expert on, I'm no expert on Plato and Socrates. I'm no expert on ancient Greek philosophy. Like, I'm an avowed amateur, and I make no bones about that. That's fine by me. So that's hopefully that's a clear admission on my part. But the fact is that that there's not a direct causal relationship between the will to produce a paper such as this and then the product of the paper as produced. It's not that we're going to will this into being straightforwardly, and what is created as a consequence of our designs. No, that's not it at all. Yeah. Not at all, right? What ends up being is not something that was preordained in my mind or in John's, right? It is the outcome of something very fitful. Yes. It's the outcome of something very fitful. And so in a way, I disidentify from it, not as a way of evading or eschewing responsibility for it, but I disidentify with it as a way of admitting to the supra-personal nature of what happens in the dialectical process. Yeah. Yeah. And that has to be understood properly if you're going to undertake the exercise of encountering it. It's not about you. It's not about me, frankly, right? It's not. John would say the same of himself. These are all simply exploratory exercises. And what comes of it are simply the footprints in the snow of that exercise that hopefully you can follow to something of value, or not, basically. Right.
And I have to say too that for me, and I think that some of this has to do with being dyslexic and ADD and having different learning disabilities and stuff, which I've talked about before, is one of the advantages I'm coming to understand as I talk to more people about this too, about having a learning disability, right, is that I had to, on some level, be able to tolerate not understanding the specificity of a word or being able to read a word, right? Because my tolerance level by necessity wasn't had to expand. Whatever word I didn't understand, like I think I ended up understanding it in some ways deeper because it would reemerge. However, it would emerge again in a whole of something that I was it was gathering in context. So when it would reemerge, I would almost kind of understand it through the back door, right? So one of the things about these kinds of conversations um, is that it's a conversation that's different than a lot of the conversations that we have, right? Like a lot of the conversations I think that we have are usually functional, right? In other words, I'm giving a directive, or I'm making a request, or I'm making a promise, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm strategizing about something that has an end aim, right? That's one,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is more like language or discourse as a kind of action to get something done in the world, right? And then there's another kind, which is more like what Heidegger would call idle talk, which is just kind of you don't think about it much. You're just like, how you doing? Oh, good. Did you see that? And you just kind of mumbling along, right?
Mm-hmm.
And idle talk is what most people are in when they're not in the other one, right?
Yeah.
And also when you're talking to yourself, oftentimes it's idle talk. And the idea of idle talk is that it's actually necessary because
Mm-hmm.
what it does is it keeps, you could say, the cultural interpretation in play and idling, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's like you could say the realm of art, the realm of philosophy, the realm of it's a different kind of conversation, right? In that, actually, Johannes, in a video that we did yesterday, he said something
Yes, I've seen
about
part of it. Uh,
yeah, he said
yeah,
something
yeah,
about being
very
a
interested.
philosopher that really caught my attention. He said it's very rare that a philosopher's thought is timely, right?
Yes,
And he says he doesn't know, but he suspects that actually his thought, right, in being a
yes,
philosopher, actually has something directly to say to the times. And what
yes.
that implies is usually philosophy. Philosophy is a kind of thinking that that is powerful, but not necessarily immediately useful, right? It's more like philosophy is thinking about things like in what is intelligibility itself, right? What are those presuppositions and those kind of things that are invisible to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I somehow I stand on to then be able to gossip and talk and do all these other things. What are those things that are often like transparent to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet I stand on to do everything. You
Mm-hmm.
could say
Mm-hmm.
that by definition, that conversation is not the process of standing on. It's a
Mm-hmm.
process of unearthing
That's
what's
right.
concealed, right?
That's right.
And
That's right.
picking it up and furthering it and making it present. And so it's a conversation that isn't useful, right?
Yes.
But yet determinate.
Very determinate.
Yeah.
Very determinate. Yeah, I mean, determinate of the ideations that are going to ultimately the become worlds that we then live in and through. Right. I'm thinking of this. It's a word that Kierkegaard used, but the German equivalent, I'm trying to remember. It's like it's a great word. Germans have this way of talk about nomenclature. The Germans are just unparalleled. I think Lebensanschauung, I think, is the word, and it's this idea that it's the life view. It's the idea we live in and through. Something like that, right? That the ideation becomes the world in its entirety. And I think that the role of the philosopher, which I think is contiguous with exactly what you've just described, is the person that peers into the interstices of the world
Mm.
that we live in and sees
Mm.
the sees and sees the presence of absence within that world.
Yeah.
Right.
Sees the presence of absence within
Yes.
that world. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like seeing, illuming the areas where the boards of the edifice don't quite touch together.
Yeah.
Right. And from which darkness, protrudes.
Yeah.
Or light protrudes, depending on how you want to spin the metaphor. So it's and that's why it's such an attentional business, right? The business of philosophy is trying to notice the gaps.
And kind of bringing this home on a personal level of, okay, say I'm not a philosopher, right? If say I don't have any predisposition for caring about philosophy, we'll say I just want to grow as a person, right? And what does engaging, and this is the thing that John really highlighted that I've been getting at a deeper level, and I've been noticing myself consolidate around, like something really coheres, is this, as John talks about, he's been doing a lot of field work where he's been going out in these different practices that are responses to what he's calling the meeting crisis, and like circling and authentic relating and different kinds of movement practices and meditation practices, all those things. And one of the things he says is like, it seems like they're getting the psychological cognitive aspect deeply, and even to some degree the existential aspect, but the ontological aspect, right, mm-hmm. is the part that seems to get not any attention. Mm-hmm. And what he said to me in the last conversation I had with him, it was that I heard it differently this time. He says, I want to see more Philosophia. Mm. And he said, I didn't hear it as like John wants to see more. No, what he's saying is from his perspective, that those things that are trying to respond to the meaning crisis may not be able to respond unless there's a realness, like a sense of Philosophia, that it's not just like something that would be nice as an added option, right? But actually it may not be addressing what it's attempting to address without that element at play. And I think one of the places, one of the people that really that gets at this in a very beautifully poetic way is David White, when he talks about levels of attention and its relationship and how it constitutes identity, right? Because one of the things he said, is like, as he would say, as I started to notice my deepening levels of attention started to develop, my sense of who I was directly in proportionate to that, mm-hmm. right? Because if a self is always in an arena, and if the quality of my ability to pay attention, right, makes the arena more or less, or some qualitative shift starts to show itself to me, then that self is going to be in relationship to that. So if you want a shift in your identity, start to pay attention in new ways.
Exactly.
And this is the way I think the practice of Philosophia, for me, it's oriented. It's on one level, there's like understanding the insight, but the insight's important. But I think the thing that it's the machinery that you exercise and coordinated to have that insight starts to bleed into everything else, where all of a sudden you can start to notice the negative shape in what your mom just said, where you never saw that gap before. And then you're able to go, and then because you could see it, right? Then you can, and it's not just seeing it, then you can respond to it. You go, hey mom, what about that like black thing that's kind of, I never noticed before when you used to say that thing.
That's right. That's right.
Opens up knowing your mother in ways that you've never had before, that has you exercise ways of communicating that lead to new things. And so this is on one level, it doesn't have immediate practical value in some one-to-one relationship. It's even more primarily, it starts to operate on what occurs as practical at all. It's like
Mm-hmm.
whatever that background that has the world show up to you in the way that it does. If there was the place where you could put your attention, where that lies, is I think where philosophy continually addresses, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of the exercise, I think.
Yeah. Ah, well said, Guy. Well said.
Sweet. All right. Shall we read?
We shall read. Okay, so I think I remember where we left off.
Okay.
It's on page 4, because I think the last thing I read was the line that culminated in the divine double. Andrew Stang's divine double. Okay, so we're at the beginning of the last paragraph on the 4th page.
Okay.
All right. Should I go ahead or?
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, you're reading it better. We don't have to deal with my learning disability.
Okay, interrupt me whenever you like. We might tidy our understanding of dialectic with the following metaphor to be reprised throughout the chapter. Imagine the organizing self as a musical orchestra, just like Plato's partite soul. In this analogy, the signifying logos is the sounding of the instruments. The Socratic symbol conducts a melody to invoke a transjective state of play, and the melody coheres the logos to harmonize the orchestral sections. Meanwhile, this analogy can transfer in both directions between intrapersonal and interpersonal levels of play. The dialogue is also an orchestral arrangement, and dialogos is the playing together that gathers the instruments of self in the sounding of other selves. In both scenarios, the flowing melody is the dialectic presence that harmonizes the instruments within the self, between the selves, and between the intra and interpsychic orchestras. Dialectic aspiration, and Callard's proleptic rationality, is the conduction of novel melodies to complexify orchestral rhythms, evolving our capacity to play involute measures until the intra and interpersonal chording becomes a tuning for transpersonal concerts. In both individual and collective orchestral models, dialectic transmutes intelligence, the aptitude for music, right? This is simply extending the same metaphor, into rationality, the aptitude for harmony, and rationality into wisdom, the harmony that seeks concert. The relational presence of this melody binds the instruments into a shared identity of accession, much like a crew mobilizes in the anatomy of a moving vessel, a chariot, for instance, and arranges to face the frontier. The team spirit of dialectic is of the players and beyond the players, like the daimon, and it enchants the participant knowers with its symbolizing vitality. The melodic motion possesses the cadence of each individual performer, explaining the common phenomenon of a collective being, quote, more than the sum of its parts, unquote, like how 4 good musicians can gather into genius. For example, the Beatles.
Pause 1 second. I just want to kind of be with that paragraph. So that really, what just struck me here is where the 3 things are listed. In both scenarios, the flowing melody is the dialectic presence that harmonizes the instrument. Within the self, between the self, between the selves, and between the intra and interpsychic orchestras. And then there was that part where, it's actually this part. In both individual and collective orchestral models, a dialectic transmutes intelligence, the aptitude for music. Okay, so the dialectic itself, right, the back and forth, is transmuting. So that is transmuting intelligence. So this back and forth that's going on, right, is it's like transmuting the sound in a certain sense, right? So, and that's intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to make sure I get this. Then the aptitude for music, right, transmutes intelligence. The aptitude for music So dialectic is transmuting the intelligence, that's the aptitude for music, into rationality, the aptitude for harmony. Interesting. So there's the aptitude for music itself. So to be able to hear and attune to intelligibility,
Mm-hmm.
and then into rationality, the aptitude for harmony. Okay. Harmony and rationality into wisdom, the harmony that seeks concert. God damn, that's gorgeous. So gorgeous.
Oh, thank you.
So gorgeous. I mean, it really like strikes home into rationality, the aptitude for harmony. So there's a way in which I can actually have an aptitude for concert, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that aptitude brings us together, that attunes me into rationality, the aptitude for harmony. So I can now tend to how harmonious are the flowing of intelligibility is, the music that's playing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And respond to it, and then and rationality into wisdom, the harmony that seeks concert. So this is it's interesting, the rationality into wisdom. So when the rationality starts to seek harmony, as it seeks harmony, it starts to, the harmony starts to like the harmony itself starts to reveal that the harmony is seeking concert, right? There's something about that I like about it, like where it's like the wisdom is the thing that is in some way, the music itself, the harmony itself is actually within the music itself is starting to see concert. That's the wisdom. It's inherent within the movement of relations and the intelligibility and the rationality. I just wanted to make sure and sink into that.
No, that's a great elaboration, Guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Next paragraph.
The dialectic current is an aspiring rationality, a view from above that ideates a cosmic chorus. When we catch it, as it catches us, it inspires new arrangements for our orchestra that change the way we play by playing together. Dialogos disposes a character of ontodramatic irony. The novel melody cultivates aspiration by dialoguing the participant knower through a play of different motifs, for example, stories, myths, and games, then retunes the knower by rephrasing those motifs, reflexing her attention to her own transformation, revealing her potential to be a new kind of self. Dialectic is the melody of transformation that scores over the scenes, ironizing each moment of play with foreknowing ignorance. For example, the young man plays classical music knowing he may someday appreciate it, plays the uncle knowing he may someday be father, sounds out a language knowing he may someday be fluent. The view from above aspires our logos to expand from its current frame, that is, it transframes perspective, and in so doing, guides the gathering soul to seek itself in mystery. Quote, "For just this reason, it is fair that only a philosopher's mind grows wings, since its memory always keeps it as close as possible to those realities by being close to which the gods are divine," close quote from the Phaedrus. Anamnesis of this meta-attentional rationality is analogized by the charioteer in Plato's Phaedrus, quote, "the soul's steersman," unquote, who uses the unseen presence of, quote, "the place beyond heaven," unquote, to gather his horses, instruments, in Gnosis, concert, with the forms. It is tempting to contrast this famous journey with an antipodal myth, that of Phaeton, the brash son of Apollo who presumed to pilot his father's chariot with no such view from above, was unable to muster the horses and scorched the earth in flame. His myth brings character to the noxious consequence of ungathered conversations and the ungathered cells they conduce, adducing fresh stakes to the Socratic maxim that the unexamined life, an unaspiring flight, so defined, is not worth living.
Yeah, I just have a feeling a lot of this is going to be start to blossom out as it goes on.
Okay. Shall I
Yeah.
keep going? What do you think? Okay.
Yeah. Unless there's anything you want to say about that.
Nope. No, I'm going to try not to annotate it wherever possible too, because if it's not, if it doesn't explain itself, then you know what I mean? Okay. All right. The 4 ways. So this is on to a new section now. The 4 ways of knowing: proposition, procedure, perspective, and participation. This won't be new to anyone who has followed John's series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, or who has seen any number of his videos in which he discusses this. So this is a component, a sort of a theoretical. This is a theoretical apparatus that he has had in his tool belt for some time. And anyway, okay. So the 4 ways of knowing: proposition, procedure, perspective, and participation. To better understand the dialectic of an examined life and its impact on our knowing, we must first understand more expressly what we mean by knowing. For this, we offer 4 categories or ways of parceling the epistemic definition. Typologies are not essential, of course, but useful insofar as they lend intelligibility, or Pascal's spirit of geometry, to darkling patterns, allowing us to gain understanding of our cognition and intervene in its processes. Aspiringly, then, the provision of these types will, with continual reference to Socrates, advance the epistemic project by describing its constituents more closely. The first is propositional knowing. Gold is a mineral. The equator crosses Columbia. The normal human body is 37 degrees Celsius. Propositions set constraining criteria, that is, rules that help us to realize relevant implications of information. Propositional knowing is a linguistic knowing that marked by apophantic and inferential reasoning. It provides factuality. Yet the constraint of propositions can become idolatrous, and when unyielding, they freeze frame our perspective. See ahead. For this reason, Socrates uses propositions as dialogic rudders, indexically, to steer the vessel of attention to epistemic significance. And
now just think, I zoomed back to the beginning where it talks about, the loss of the second person, right? And if you lose the second person, like, you lose so many ways of knowing, and all you have are these kinds of propositional statements to situate yourself in, because you have no access to process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Which brings us to the issues of creedal arrogation that we often refer to as being the sort of the things that concentrate and freeze our philosophy and our theology into idolatry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Procedural knowing: catching a ball, driving a car, changing a diaper. Procedure is a non-linguistic knowing how-to combined of conscious and preconscious actions that realize relevant interactions and affect a power to impact on the world. While propositions condition rules, procedure conditions routine. For instance, Socrates uses the techne of Elenchus to entrain discussion within a routine of socialized exchanges, observable in Plato's dialogues. If the proposition is the single note of knowing, the procedure is undoubtedly its rhythm. Nice. Perspectival knowing. Do you want to jump in, Guy?
No.
Okay. Perspectival knowing: suspicious, maternal, desirous, regretful. Perspective is the knowing what it is like to be, a situational awareness that realizes relevant states of consciousness and cognition, a presence of here-ness and being in the world, an agent-arena relationship that gives off a sense of presence and placement. Imagine visiting the house where you grew up as a child. Almost certainly, the presence of home has changed as your role as the child has shifted. The house seems smaller. The bedroom doesn't invite you to play. Proposition and procedure are grounded in the presence of relationships, and so we invoke this presence to inform these ways of knowing. For example, a teacher might situate a math problem, the proposition, in a grocery store, the perspective, for the students to practice solving, the procedure. Nietzsche, of course, made this point famously. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, and the more effects we allow to speak about one thing, the more different eyes we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. Close quote. In Plato's dialogue, Socrates situates perspective within dramaturgy. The multivocality of characters allows for the casting of eyes and adoption of different propositions. If proposition is the note and procedure the rhythm, perspective is the signature role sounded by the body of each instrument. Participatory knowing. Participation is the most difficult way of knowing to explain because it is also the most ineffable. It realizes the relevant forms of life, the existential moding of our being. Proposition is not the subjective character of perspective, which seems personal, or the objective lexicality of propositions, which seems impersonal, but belongs in the transjective, the verbal in-between. Participatory knowing leads the gathering logos to a state of religio, a sacral experience of connectedness and transpersonal relating to reality. It is therefore mediated by symbola, connecting tissues of enculturation, self to world, ecological coupling, agent to arena, and niching, organism to environment. In our metaphoric orchestra, participatory knowing is the embodiment of resonant vibrations, wherein the identity of a player becomes the identity of the concert in play. Our enculturing, coupling, and niching are the participles of existential attitudes that mode the character of our experience. We are, as Heidegger observed, the only beings whose being is in question, and the open question of our being participates our existence into presence, his Dasein. The roles of lover, mother, father, friend, teacher, student, elder, enemy, these cognitive structures are characters of perspective gathered by our existential moding. To take a shared perspective, we must share the query of being, to join our empty, grasping hands where the logos of knowing begins.
Yeah, so I just want to pause on that one. So I think participatory knowing of the four ways, right? I think for the most part, people can definitely grasp, procedural knowing. People can get, I'm sorry, my computer's getting a little bit, or my iPad, propositional knowing. And then people can definitely get having a perspective, right? But the participatory one is, I think, lends itself to the greatest contribution, right? That's probably the least understood. Yet the most constitutive of everything that is present for you, literally, right?
Yeah. Well, it's hardest to understand precisely because because it constitutes so much else.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like it's the one that's always kind of one. Yeah, I mean, and on another level, I really, I really like the way he brought in Heidegger here. We are, as Heidegger observed, the only beings whose being is in question, and the open question of our being that we're in participates our existence into presence. So it's like, God, that's so impregnated through and through. It's like the roles of lover, again, the roles of lover, mother, father, friend, teacher, student, elder. I would say that, like, yeah, I really, it's interesting if I think about it like this. Like, I've talked a lot about, like, how tripped out I am about how affected deeply I am in being married. And it's like, and I think I could almost say that it's through fully participating in the role of husband, right, has brought my life to presence in a way that's difficult to describe, but is all encompassing in some, right. And that even like you could have laid all this out intellectually for me, and I could have really grokked it. But the experience of being a husband so dedicated, and the wife that has come to presence through that dedication and that role, that I really do feel this sense of that we're playing a role, but that role is transforming the guy playing it at the same time.
Yeah,
and
you're no
sense of surroundedness, like it's encompassed my whole life in the feel and texture, of the way that things are present for me. I never quite thought about it in terms of participatory knowing, but I think that's really kind of it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. Well, because the way in which you are participated and which you participate, and I'm like deliberately playing with the transitivity of the verb, right? Again, an instance of the kind of creative license required to wrap ourselves around the texture of the experience also changes the way your attention is directed to, right? The details that become salient to you, become relevant to you. John will like be using that word. Changes, right? What presents to you changes. What you read into changes, right? There's a textual difference in what is read and read into in any given detail of your phenomenology. And because of that, the world changes quite utterly, quite fundamentally, right? It changes phenomenally, and that's a very difficult thing to understand, except as a gnosis, as a conformed experience, as a living out and living through, as opposed to a knowing that or knowing of.
Interesting. In a place where this kind of goes south a lot, right? There's something about participatory knowing that I've thought about this before is there's this quality about being human, right? And I think even Wincott would say that it's, the sense of participating in something is like a womb or a holding environment, right? And what Wincott, and if you look at it, I think when we say it's some way, right? When we refer to it's in general, right? On some level, there's this quality of a surroundedness, right? That which is holding me, that's greater than the sum of all of its parts that I'm inside of. So for an example of this would be, one way to look at it is your first womb is in the mother's belly, right? And that usually goes pretty well, except for you almost die right at the end. But then you pop out, and given that human beings, and this is fascinating to me, given that we're so instinct poor, right? And that I had an evolutionary scientist who was a client of mine who was funny when he would talk about this, because he would just go crazy. It's like, human infants make no sense, right? By any other standard, by any other mammal that we know about, we'd come out at about 4 or 5 years old, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, you mean like the long, the protracted developmental gestation period.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Just imagine the mood your mother would be in.
Yeah.
But this sense of that human beings are the most helpless, most dependent, futile, like living things that we know about in the known universe, right?
Right.
And what's interesting about that is that being the case, how we start off, who are the ones that like can kind of almost see back to the Big Bang, right?
Yes.
There's a mixed experience of that vulnerability and what that vulnerability makes possible, right?
Right.
Is huge. But you could say that, like, so Wincott would say, so the second holding environment, the second womb, is your childhood, right? And it's interesting with this, because this is getting into this participatory knowing. To whatever degree that holding environment held you, right? And in places where it didn't, there was ruptures somewhere, right? And you could say that it grows you up, and where there was ruptures, right, is the third holding environment, which is usually people call their life. And what the third holding environment would be is something like I think in a participatory way, indexing reality in terms of the old holding environment, so that I can like marry my mother and then try really hard to fix that problem. But the problem is, right, is that although it looks like you're really trying to get that to not be there anymore, the holding environment, the way you're participating, constitutes the environment itself. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
That's right.
So one of the things I've noticed in this kind of where this distinction has like helped me in terms of being with people and understanding people and having things more available is I would often notice in circling where somebody would start talking and then they start going on a rant, and they start addressing concerns that no one brought up. Right? But then you watch where people who don't have those concerns now have those concerns in
Right.
just the right way that like justify that person having the concerns. And then they keep enacting this environment over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It becomes a kind of collective projection
Yeah.
that suffuses the conditions of your actuality with those of your sort of intrapsychic life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's
That's
interesting,
why. Sorry. Go on.
yeah, and what's interesting is when I've explored that with people before, oftentimes I'll be like, "Wait a minute, what? I don't think you were concerned about that before. How come you're, And we start to realize,
Yeah.
oh, I'm doing that, and the person being, at the center of the circle or who has their attention on, right, is at first is like, oh, thank God,
Yeah.
but it will get okay. Let's all kind of refrain from the elicitations, and then
Yes.
guess what happens for that person? That person starts to quiver and shake, and they don't know who they are
Yes.
without people getting in their folding chairs, the invisible folding chairs that they set up around them, because the self oftentimes is constituted by that object relation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't hate me in that way, or if you already approve of me, let's say, but I'm identified with trying to get your approval, and you keep approving, then I don't know who I am. And
Mm-hmm.
if you hold that for a while and you kind of tolerate the shake, something starts to crack open, right?
That's right.
Than that, a different kind of intelligibility starts to come
That's
out.
right.
But what that is in a certain sense, it's like the way that participants or knowing can bind itself
Yeah.
into really procedures that don't work, I guess, like a procedural knowing that's habitual.
Yeah.
Right. And then you make conclusions about reality and you can get that thing in an autopoetic, like a dyslexic autopoetic process.
Right. That becomes a kind of reciprocal narrowing.
Yeah.
In Mark Lewis's term. Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that's right. That's right. Because the fundamental mode of participation, it's so constitutive of the other ways of knowing, quite preconsciously, that to get to the source of the participatory moding requires a kind of intervention that we're often ill-equipped for, right? It's the kind of intervention that depth psychology, right, for people like Jung was targeted to, right? To try, like, how do you get a person to prescind projections that are a consequence of the way that they are a consequence of the participles of their existential moding, right? How do you get to the source of those modes and effect shifts in those modes, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, for someone like Jung, it was the process, was the individuating process of the dialectic with one's own unconscious, with the contents and formal context of one's own personal and transpersonal experience of the unconscious. And that's so interesting because that process, I'm thinking more about that right now, and John and I are doing some work on that right now about how the interiorization of the dialectical dynamic that's otherwise described in this chapter and that we're talking about right now is applicable to those therapeutic methods of depth psychology, right? At least certain strains of it. That if you can take that dynamic that is fundamentally geared to opening the reciprocity of the personal and the transpersonal, right? That second person that seems to issue to you from without. And then the sort of more egoic form of self that seeks to manage and contrive. That the paired dialogue between those two dimensions of being and participation is precisely what can shift and open that revolving circle that you've just described. Yeah. Right? And change the way that it cycles, change the direction in which it cycles.
Right. Right.
but it's a difficult thing to access precisely because it has to be accessed at the level of fundamental participation. And that's why, and this is what the whole next section is going to be about in the paper, right? That's why it involves the espousal and enactment of analogies. That's why it's a symbolizing process, because it has to be, it's a circumambulatory process. It actually has to be acted through. It's not something that you can proposition your way out of. It's something that has to be embodied and known analogically. And that's why mythopoesis is the native language to that kind of participating transformations, because it's a language that speaks to the enactment of patterns that we fundamentally know in the vesture of myth, in the vesture of storytelling, right? And that's why, like, from Plato through to Jung, one interpersonal, interpsychic, one fundamentally intrapersonal and intrapsychic, they resound with the same dynamics, precisely because to get to the source of your fundal existential moding requires a kind of enactment that can be only realized properly mythopoetically. And that's why all of this ratiocination ultimately needs to be grounded out in that kind of semiosis and feed back to it, right? So there's not only the dialectic intrapersonally and intrapersonally, but there's also a dialectic revolving between what we might call the logos, the gathering, and the mythos, right? Which is essentially the protrusion and profusion of that more imagistic, or rather imaginal, creation of the spontaneous flow that changes the phenomenology of how we experience the world and experience one another, right? And then the cycle between the disillusion of that descent into sort of the mythopoetic chaos of acting through and being unconstrained by your propositional knowing, and then regathering it to something that coheres and maintains a kind of tautness or tension, is precise. Like, that's its own dimension of the dialectic process, right? So it's like radially the same fundamental praxis is operating along different axes simultaneously, and it's precisely the convergence of those axes that powers and makes the process fundamentally efficacious, right? But it's a difficult thing to explain, because its efficacy is owed to its distribution, to its diffuseness, right? So to source it is a difficult thing, precisely for that reason. To source both the kind of knowing of participatory knowing and its interventions.
And so it's almost like, and here's kind of bringing it back to dialectic. If, for say, like somebody like Socrates, right, who's got zeroed in on all these different dimensions at once, right? He asks a question, and the person who's answering it assumes that he's looking for the answer to that question, right? But actually, he's looking for him to answer that question and realize he just tied himself into a knot, right?
Yeah.
So that the knot reveals the constraint that he's in, that reveals the thing that he wasn't seeing before. So there's this quality of where, and it's one of the things I like about working with groups a lot, is that you can kind of see these dynamics play out, right? In kind of the distribution of, say, there's some anxiety that's assumed and it's taking place, and somebody's weaving their web and they're recreating their holding environment. And then if somebody can kind of notice that, the moment you notice that, boom, something goes meta and it drops away for a second, right? And then you have this choice where you can go fully into it, or you can consciously refrain from it and see who you are in the face of the not participatory. So there is this way in where we kind of hone ourselves to each other, right? In a certain sense.
Exactly.
Like you say something, like maybe it's 80% mother issues and 20% relevant to what we're talking about. And then I maybe frustrate that and I just bring attention to that. And then And so there's that kind of way where we can have that kind of the musicality can begin to
well, exactly. I was just going to say that's where the music, that's where the musicality metaphor then comes in, right? Because it's the tuning. The tuning of oneself is commensurate with the tuning between individuals, between your instruments, as it were. And then the ontology of the discourse has to be our attention to the ontology of discourse and dialectic also has to be directed to the right level, because then the semiosis of the discourse, its meaning is not to be found in the content of each proposition. It's to be found in the it's to be found in the role that the proposition takes in the overall discourse, in the body of the overall discourse, right? So the meaning of this proposition isn't simply its semantic meaning. The meaning of the proposition is its contribution to the overall process in play. Just like you were talking before about idle talk, right? Heidegger's definition of idle talk. And the better question to ask, I think, to properly understand the semiosis of any given interaction is not what is being, or for the purpose of reframing attention, at least, just as a little thought experiment. The better question to ask in many cases is not what is meant, but what is lived. I'm borrowing from your way of speaking precisely because it's so remarkably useful in cases like this, Guy. What is being lived in this speech, not what is being meant in the speech. That's why intimation, the term intimation, is so useful, precisely because it's listing to intimacy and meaning at the same time. What's lived in idle chatter is the reaffirmation and reinforcement of contact, the continuity of that contact, right? The meaning of the conversation I have with my neighbor who lives down the hall when we're in the elevator coming up with our groceries is not, how are you? Good. How are you? Rainy day today, isn't it? It because the content of it could not possibly be more banal. But what is lived in the discourse, what is intimated by that discourse, then the right way to understand the semiosis of that discourse is the reattachment of the relation, or perhaps the reinforcement, or the contributions that we're both making in concert to tend to the binding of the relationship and the rapport that we have with one another, right?
Yeah.
It's precisely the tending to the relationship itself that is the meaning of that discourse, right, rather than its contents. And so then the Socratic dialogues, I think, are very much that, just on a different scale, right? The trading of propositions signifies beyond the propositions. That seems very clear.
It's almost like I just get this sense it's constantly honing your attention on what is most, the discernment between what is the, because it seems like I asked this question on Facebook the other day, and then I thought about it. I'm like, God, what is my answer to this question? Which is like, if you could answer one question, right? What would the question be, such that would make the biggest difference in your life, right?
If you could ask or answer the question.
What is the one question that if it were answered, right, or even articulated, right, would make the biggest difference to what's most important to you in your life, right?
That's a good question.
My answer was the wisdom of knowing where to put my attention.
Yes,
it seems like, as far as I can tell, everything is downstream from that, right?
Yes.
And I think this is kind of what the process, the content, right? All the different modes, all the different ways of knowing that you're lifting into relief in this espousing on what Socrates was getting at in Plato, on some level, I think is probably in service of that, right? Of like God, if we can come out of this conversation and I have a sense of what calls my attention, and knowing to put my attention here versus here, because it's connected to the most amount of things at the perfect amount of level, that seems to be the most valuable thing in the world.
Yep.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer to the question. And in a way, like the entire tradition, I'm being a bit simplistic here, but in a way, all mindfulness traditions presuppose the very answer you've just given.
Yeah.
That it's where we put our attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's determinative of what is real. Yeah.
Because where we put our attention, if we say, if attention is the thing that connects the agent in the arena, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also what's going to transform the arena, right? Mm-hmm. It's the thing that's most, it's that play. It's where I connect to the world the most, right?
Yep. Yep.
I'm also I'm also just appreciating, I'm just echoing many conversations with my friend, Mark Michael Lewis, who I've had a conversation with. I've known him for years. I love that guy. He always emphasizes, he's like, look, you could have intimacy and you can have amazing conversations. However, if they're not connected to a reality, right, you can have shared delusions that are euphoric, right? Yes. What is that? Does it loop back in and get us a deeper connection to that which you can't think?
That's right.
it bucks, right?
That's right. No, that's right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, because shared psychosis can be remarkably compelling.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So do you between you triangulate? Do you triangulate to an ontology that is fundamentally oriented to realness? Yeah. And then the function of the dialectic process is precisely that process of triangulation.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking about marriage again. I think the marriage is kind of oriented us to just.
I love hearing you talk about marriage in this way, because it's, well, aside from just being refreshing, when you bring that role and bring it into the center of all of this sort of the orbit, put it at the center of the sort of orbiting theories, it suddenly it plugs in so well, and it gives proper it's so exemplary of what it means to live through a role and be known by that role and be changed as a consequence of that role. Role is a terribly unfortunate term, because it applies something very, very, very trivial and puerile. And of course, I don't mean it in that way, but when you like all of this machinery and abstraction suddenly animates in a very, very beautiful way when you put marriage at the center of it and watch it interact.
Right. And I think
I find it very beautiful.
Thank you.
I always have.
Let me know I had infinity on my finger. Right. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like infinity in the sense of, because when I got married, is I think you're supposed to, when you get married, like traditionally anyways, is like you're signing a contract that you're just not, it's not an option to get out of.
Right.
Closing that door, right, and having the sense of significance or length of time to be where my attention, or the marriage draws both of our attention towards, has adjusted the micro movements with each other, right? I can imagine. Such that we're making choices and saying things in ways and responding in ways that are given by that sense of the whole coming through, right?
Right.
If you like close the escape hatch, right, which was not, boy, it took me, I don't know, over 40 years to even know that I had an escape hatch, let alone to be able to close it, right? But really doing that consolidated every moment to be a little bit like, oh yeah, it's like living this moment as if it were to happen over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's the Yeah.
Yeah. Because then to wed, because what you're doing, by the sounds of it, what you're doing in the traditional meaning of your wedding, your marriage, what you're also doing is you're, again, comes back to the dialectical dynamic, you're wedding possibility to actuality in a covenantal way.
Mm.
Because to subsist predominantly in a realm of sort of undulating possibility is precisely to be like Kierkegaard talks about that and lived it as well, lived this idea that dwelling in sort of a phantom realm of excessive possibility is a kind of infection that prevents the assumption, a person's assumption of reality in a way that will consummate their being in totality. And so that then to make that wedding between what possibility and actuality seems to require, as far as I can tell, foreclosing in an almost sacramental, yes, not in an actual sacramental way, foreclosing possibility, in order to harmonize it to what is actual and concrete, right? That there's I'm scrambling around this a little bit, but there's a sense in which you have to somehow you have to pair them, and the pairing of those two things requires a certain that process of equilibrating your sort of interior life of endless potential and your concrete life that foists very, very specific demands on you.
It necessitates it's like I think there's another leg to the stool. It's like there's the possibility, actuality, necessity, right? It's like where it's interesting. I've never really thought about marriage and the eternal return of the same, right, of Nietzsche quite together. I guess because I just can't imagine Nietzsche being married.
I don't think Nietzsche could imagine Nietzsche being married.
And that some sense of that way in which, if this moment was the moment that I would live for the rest of my life, right? It's an embedded transcendence, right? Yep. That to be aware of that, right?
Yes.
The way I am right now is the way, and will create the conditions upon which I'll live every single second, right?
Yes.
It's interesting. Possibility and actuality become so bound together that it necessitates the most optimal grip, right?
Right.
So if an example, to put some flesh on that, would be just something like, oh, I could be honest and say this thing in this way, which if I do, boy, is that going to create a great response, right? And then like she'll be anxious and I'll feel bad and then I'll be angry.
Yeah.
So instead, I'll be honest, but in a way that is more vulnerable on my behalf and self-disclosure, right?
Right.
And it's not like I feel like doing that, but somehow the horizon of forever, right?
Yeah.
Of forever.
Yeah.
Right now, like creates a will, right?
Yeah. The third person that is the relationship.
Possible, right?
Yeah.
Because the possibility, actuality feedback loop is so close.
Right. Which is
and
why
now we're doing the dialogos here.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and just thinking like that's why it requires this, like in the Augustinian sense, the sacramenta, the sacrament, the symbolizing sacrament, to actually consummate the union between those that sort of those three dimensions, precisely because the translucent property of the sacrament, of the symbolizing sacrament, permeates the membranes of those levels of being, right? What is possible and what is actual can be reciprocally permeated by something that indwells both dimensions of being, right? Because the symbolic does that. The symbolic, it's the bridge, the symbolon. It conjoins what is concrete and ostensibly of matter, and what is unseen, right? What is formally unseen, what is formally not present to us. And the formality of the sacrament, the formality of the symbolic bridge conjoins those into a shared ontology. Right. And so then it makes sense that the wedding of those dimensions of being requires a sacrament to encircle them.
So good. Interesting. See, just right here. So this is just kind of there's that sense of where we're talking about something on one level, very abstract, but but then when you play it through something really concrete, like I don't know anything more concrete in my life than my marriage, right?
Yeah.
And then it just animates the whole thing, and it reveals what the organization of that which is most concrete kind of shined forth.
That's right.
In such a way that has me abstractly more appreciative of it, that has me see it more concretely in more of a specific, this interpenetration.
That's right.
Of meaningfulness of being, right?
That's right. That's right, because it's also for you the direction of having lived the dynamic, that it doesn't need not be abstractive. It can be something properly embodied. So then the realization of its embodiment resurfaces the memory of all of its attendant experiences that return to inform the idea itself. And that's just as I was saying, it's part of why I love hearing you talk about marriage, because both in and of itself, but also especially in the way that you relate to it, it's so exemplary of all of this. It's so exemplary of all of this. And you referring to it also, and this is also something that will be discussed in the paper we'll get to eventually. But the idea that I think you just your discussion with Paul last time you talked to Paul, you were described, because you were both talking about this. I absolutely loved it. And you were talking about that, the relationship as a third personage, as a third individual. And when you were just a moment ago, and you were and that third person, the personality of your relationship has its own there is an honesty. You were talking about, I might not be honest at that moment, because somehow being straightforwardly honest in the frank and common sense of the term, the common sense meaning of the term, suddenly doesn't seem to suit the personality of the relationship. Because the personality of the relationship, if we are to envision it for a moment as a person, that person understands the ontology of truth that third entity attends to is superordinate to the one that each of you individually are attending to. That is why the emergent dynamic of the relationship is ontologically informing, precisely because the emergent personality between you has a view, has a view to truth that exceeds the two of you together.
Yes.
Right? And so what you're doing is attending to the greater truth of the relationship, the truth that I might not, tell, I might not tell my wife that I don't like something about her at this specific moment, because more fundamentally, the truth of the relationship is that is irrelevant to the that is comparably irrelevant next to the importance of maintaining a kind of sensitive attention to what is more important in the situation.
Yeah. In
Sorry,
fact,
that came out in a garble, but yeah, you know what I mean though. You know what I mean though.
Truth. You went like that. Attended to the truth.
Yeah. I keep just pointing. That's all I have. I just indexing it. Yeah.
I keep thinking about right, chronological time or temporality and characterological temporality. And I'm like, oh, this is that sense of the personality of the relationship or the character of the relationship, right, is on some level or like presenting me with more time, where it's like the atomistic chronological this now moment, right? The thing that will feel the best is to say that thing. But if I start to include the whole in the character of the whole, right?
Yes.
That really my marriage is more like an ecstatic temporality, right? That constantly is granting the moment as it is. And in fact, and this is what's interesting, even granting me the will to refrain from what I most want to do.
Yep.
Right? In service of this other thing. But here's the thing, it's not like I have to think about it. That's what's interesting, is that's where I think it's characterological or participatory. Because it's not like I stop and go, oh, right? If I did, I'm not that smart, right? Okay. If you did it chronologically, I'd have to stop and go, wait a minute. Self?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, think about this the next moment. Add time.
Yeah. Your intuition as a husband, for instance, your intuition as a husband is borrowed from the third person. And I might suggest actually that it's not an alternate temporality, it's atemporal altogether. That the third person actually is not temporally bounded in the way that you two as individuals are bounded, which is precisely why it can retrieve you from the constraints of your temporal predicaments and situations, right? That's precisely why the relationship is unto eternity, right? It's because that the emergent character of the relationship is not of time in the same way that we are.
Yeah, totally.
And can therefore retrieve your perspective from time when it becomes trapped within it.
And thus,
which is why these relationships are sacramentalized as being like, you know, the theology around this starts to make a lot of sense when conceived in this way, because like, you know, it becomes a way of understanding symbolically what is meant when it is said that marriages are of God, right?
Oh, interesting. Of God, interesting.
Right? Because suddenly, I mean, for all of the reasons we've just been describing, right? What is poeticized by the body of your relationship, the one you're describing, right? Is if it's something that triangulates us beyond the temporal, and it's kind of there's a transcendent ontogenesis that happens as a consequence of that relationship. Then suddenly, you know, the language, like the scriptural language and philosophic language that attributes deep properties of sacredness to these kinds of relationships becomes much, much more intelligible when we understand truly what is happening in the course of these relationships when cultivated properly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of going back to God, actually, just that when you just said that, marriage is of God. I'm like things just went saturated with presence, you know, in that sense.
Yeah, and I can't qualify it, but you just know know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. This thing you brought up, the conversation with Paul, that conversation's still reverberating with me, right? Because I think I found myself kind of apprehending, right, what it is to be a pastor a bit, right? And what I really got about Paul is that what, for him, imagine this. Imagine basically the central thing in your life is 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 ontologically constituted in such a way that you stand very close to the center of it, and whoever happens to walk in, you're married to.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't matter their race, creed, class, if they smell, if they're sane or unsane, that you are wedded to them for life. And I really got how deeply true that was for him.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and I was just kind of this. So one of the things that, like, out of that conversation, I found myself in running a circling group that night. And I was sitting down and everyone was doing this check-in. And I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. There's a way, right, that Paul has whoever comes in. There's a way that his life gives the significance of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when someone comes into my life, what do I do? Right? I just started, and I think what was interesting about that was just this sense of realizing I'm not saying that I should do what Paul does. It's more like something about that conversation made a distinction that, like, wait a minute, there's a way that when a stranger comes into my life, there is something that I do in relationship to that Paul does as a pastor in that role in which he is completely saturated through and through with, right?
Yeah.
But just having that sense of that's like, I just don't see, it's just not just given that somebody comes into my life who's a stranger and that's neutral or something. No, there's a way that I relate to that. And how do I relate to that? And I didn't really have an answer to that question, right?
Yeah.
But I tried on Paul's version, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I could do it.
Paul's version's hard.
Did I have some preferences that were a lot more senior to
like it's interesting that you say that, because I mean, well, so I think that there's a very, very valid point and a very clear point of comparison between the two of you, if I can take the liberty. Paul is like, what a singular person Paul is. Like, Paul's so endlessly impressive to me because he holds a sacred office, but he holds it. He strikes this combination of what we were talking about, I think last time, that the combination of identification and disidentification from the persona of the role that he occupies, and he seems to play it like right on the edge of its most, like something about the way he has assumed the vesture of his position.
Yeah.
He does it so with such reverent seriousness, and yet there is also a playfulness at the same time to what he does, and he strikes that balance like prodigiously. And that, like, that constantly I mean, there are many things about him that are impressive, but that being one of them. But see, to me, you're comparable in that you, like Paul, in my eyes at least, have a sense, not in the formal way he does, but you in your way have a sense of vocation, and you hold an office that is affiliated with that chosen vocation. And the choice of affiliation to that vocation strikes me as a decision that you make in every waking moment of a new encounter.
Right.
That it's something that possesses you, but that you also possess, right? And so there's something both. There's something now both implicit and also volitional about the move you make when you encounter somebody new. And I think for Paul, something very similar is happening. But because the offices that you each hold respectively, and the practices and the liturgies, if I can use that term. And the rituals associated with each of those offices are different. You're also accustomed to using those in your approach. And because the manners are very different, the approaches are very different. But fundamentally, the way in which you identify with your position within circling, for instance, strikes me as favorably comparable to the way that Paul identifies with his.
Interesting. It's having me actually remember a number of years ago, I think it was 2013 or 14, I did a student of mine who was going through, I think, seminary school, is it?
Mm-hmm.
And part of his education was he created a curriculum for a class, and he had me come and basically lead a 6-month circling training for ministers.
Oh, that must have been interesting.
Yeah. And it was really interesting because I think the thing I remember, one is I walked away from that going, God, I was so impressed with what it was to be a minister.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're almost like this mediation point between the community and their relationship with God, right? Mm-hmm. On some level, like you're the translator, probably for both ends, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how Paul's like when he's doing everything that he's doing, he's actually doing it as a minister because he's getting associated with all of the different arguments and the points and the things going on in the culture so that he can be able to hear like somebody speak a particular thing and then connect it, the theology and the liturgy, and weave it together. I mean, I just thought about that. This is a really cool, that is such an awesome, an awesome position to be in. One that apparently is easy to burn out.
Oh, I can imagine.
Because it's not obvious what level of participation do you engage in that conversation, right?
No.
And apparently
exactly.
It's really common for ministers to get way too overstressed logistically because they're constantly responding to too concrete of a level, right? That's optimal. So they spread to, and then they end up they lose touch with their own reasons why they're doing it and stuff. Oh, I get it. I guess that's a moment by moment, like a problem that every human being has really. The
economy of it, I think what you're describing in some ways is like the economy of the role must be incredibly, the risk of being depleted very, very quickly. Would always linger over you, which is why it strikes me that would require the right combination you would need to have the right temperament, and you would also need to be a very judicious person. You would need to know, well, again, where to direct your attention, how to direct your attention, how intensively, how extensively, right? To direct your attention. And that, I mean, of course, I imagine that would be something you would learn by the training of by training the intuition of your office. You would learn it over the course of time. But it strikes me as, I think you would probably also need to step in there with predisposed with a certain kind of temperament and a certain, you would need to really have the right combination of your wits, a stalwart sense of responsibility, resilience, and just just a really well-honed insight. And like having that combination of traits is exceedingly rare. So that's why when you encounter someone who holds the office and holds it with great integrity, as Paul clearly does, and as you do in your domain, it's a rare thing, and it galvanizes people implicitly, right? People are drawn to people like that, precisely because they see they see the light that gathers around them, and so they flock. It's like there's no more Christian metaphor I could possibly use than that one, right? They flock to the person.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
So you want to do one more paragraph and just?
Well, okay. Yeah. Well, why don't I just finish the section? I think there's one more paragraph left in the section, and then that works well. Is it just a paragraph? I hope so. Hang on. I got to bring this document
great.
up
I'm
again.
having a blast.
Oh God, no, it's not just one more paragraph left in the section. Okay, yeah, let's just do one more paragraph. We'll finish the section. All right.
Well, we can probably finish this section. If we'll see how it goes.
You want me to finish the section?
I want.
Okay, I'll keep reading till you tell me to shut up.
Okay.
How's that? All right. Okay, so we've just finished talking about participatory knowing. Mm-hmm. 2 examples may companion this typology. Typology being the 4 ways of knowing. 3 examples, sorry. 3 examples may companion this, I thank you. The first follows Wittgenstein, who once quipped that if lions could talk, we wouldn't understand them. This turns out to be a provocative test for our typology. We can appreciate a lion's features propositionally, observe their behaviors procedurally, and share some awareness that perspectively situates the relation to survival. For example, states that compel them to hunt, seek shade, or socialize. Ultimately, though, the subjective character of the lion's experience, that is, what it is like for a lion to be a lion, that's riffing off of a famous essay that Nagel wrote, What It's Like to Be a Bat, remains unavailable to us because our self-to-world relations are existentially incommensurable. Yet, while we do not fully share a lion's form of life, there is a partial conformity of situations such that we can characterize a lion in ways that expand our situational awareness and deepen the query of logos. The early shaman prototyped this mimetic potential to increase his cognitive flexibility. He played the lion to lionize himself, and in so doing, personified the lion. By imitation, the shaman conformed himself to the lion's perspective to induce a knowing ecstasis. In other words, he played himself deeper into ontos with a lion's share of being. The personification lionization loop elasticized the shaman's sense of presence and modal participation, reciprocally opening him, his culturing, niching, and ecology to development by realizing his relation to alternate forms of life. Millennia later, recent robotic explorations on Mars have inspired similarly mimetic exercises within the modern scientific enterprise. Remote operators of the Mars exploration rovers use a combination of gesture, speech, and sociability to anthropomorphize the rover and technomorphize their bodies to presence its ambulation. These embodied imaginations niche the machine. They conform the operator's knowing to the rovers by conjoining proposition, procedure, and perspective into a participatory enactment, such that the driver's being marries to the rover, and she comes to see with the rover's eye view.
Great.
We find a third, more conforming example in the relation of a mother to her child. Someone may have correct beliefs about motherhood, the know-how for mothering, awareness to take motherly roles, all without knowing as a mother. When a person becomes a participating mother, her development becomes coextensive with her child's development. To grow the child, she goes with the child and shares in its growing identity. In so doing, the mother's knowing becomes a conforming participation, a mutual selfing with her child that passes beyond understanding. It becomes loving. Her maternity is gathered as her being is remoted, and by being known as mother, her knowing becomes motherly. The mother's participatory knowing emerges from within the second person perspective, the thou of her knowing child, the perspective that knows her as mother. She plays through the presence of her child to realize his maternity, to realize her maternity, just as the shaman lionized himself to realize his humanity.
Wow.
Thou of the child is a mother's form of life, her existential mode of being in participation. As the shaman to the lion, scientist to rover, or mother to her child, we to ourselves become thou in dialogos, the second person in whose knowing we find a serious form of play that commits a self to a new form of life. We will exposit the symbolic transjectivity of thouing in a later section. In the dialectic of Philosophia, Socrates is the thou in whose knowing we remote, whose midwifery delves and delivers us, the child, toward our ontos, deeply, knowingly, to the groundless ground of being.
Wow, okay. So
Dialectic, I'll just for this one more paragraph here.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Dialectic is the appreciation of our knowing, presented in these fourfold types, through a form of cultivated reciprocal relating that plays the logos of our identity through discursive exercises, intersubjective and intrasubjective, to soundly deepen its gnosis. In order to understand the efficacy of this discursive rationality, the same embodied imagination that allows scientists to somatize the presence of technology and characterize its knowing, we must first understand its signaling mechanism, the notations of the melody that tune each instrument to prepare its intimate death and concert. That is the vessel of the enacted analogy. And that is the topic of the next section.
Enacted analogy. I just wanted to read this last paragraph, this last sentence again. We will, the second to last one that you read. We will exposit the symbolic transjectivity of thouing. We will exposit the symbolic transjectivity of thouing in a later section. In the dialectic of Philosophia, Socrates is the thou in whose knowing we remode. So it's like, in other words, so as we read the dialogues, Socrates is the thou in whose knowing we remode, whose midwifery delves and delivers us, the child, toward our ontos, our being, deeply knowing to the groundless ground of being. Interesting. So okay, what you're saying, what you mean by making Socrates, let's see, Socrates is the thou in whose knowing we remode. Okay, so we know Socrates is a thou in which we remode. And what do we remode it to? If he's a thou, I'm imagining it's Socrates talking and he's thou and I'm listening to him. To remode, what is that? What is that again?
Well, he's changing the way in which we participate in our own identity and know through our own identity.
I got it. Okay.
Right? The relationship of gnosis we have with ourselves and our identity is bundled significantly with the knowing relationship we have writ large with the objects of our experience, right? So our thou encounter with Socrates is the experience of being known through Socrates' knowing and conforming to the knowing of Socrates as thou, to whom I identify and through whom I now identify. Right. So the identification with and through Socrates remodes the way in which our participatory knowing attends, in terms of our attention, to our experience. And that's also reflexive, right? It also affects the way in which we deport ourselves as knowers. So Socrates effects a fundamental change in identity, and gnosis is such that the fundamental change in the identity of the knower is the change in the process of knowing, right? They are consistent. The change that's affected is consistent in both the subjects and objects of knowing, precisely because it is transjective, right? It bridges the domains.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Okay, got it. And so there's a way in which Socrates vows, right, where his T gets a lot bigger, such that knowing thou, the I that knows thou, it retrofits it in a certain sense, that like to know the grandness, let's say, of Socrates or Jesus or whoever, or your mentor or your teacher, that to really espouse an I-thou relationship, the I must become an I worthy of knowing as thou. So it's like this, it's the reflexivity. So I walk away from that, although I may describe it like how Socrates is so great, I don't notice I'm taller. And I'm influxing my voice in a way that I've never done it before. And I may not even notice that until somebody goes, "You sound like Socrates." You're like,
right. Right. Yeah. My reflection grows in proportion to the Socratic estimation of my knowing. Right. So imagine it's like, so I guess in a more of a, in it phrased as more of a classic Platonism or classic Neoplatonism, Socrates sees, Socrates' view to eternity, right? His daimonic disposition is such that Socrates sees and pronounces the eternal in the individual, right? He knows, he can know and realize your the soul that both by art and by nature conforms to 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 sort of the higher being of the good, the higher forms of intelligibility, that are in likeness to the soul of the individual. Socrates is in effect the one who mediates the conformity, the one who can recognize and recollect the resemblance, who can recollect the affinity that the individual soul has with the intelligible forms.
Totally.
I hesitate to drift into that domain because it starts to more concretely theorize the discursions of Socrates within the dialogues, and that's precisely what we want to avoid, because we want to avoid the propositional, the prioritization of the propositional over that of the procedural and the participatory and the perspectival. But the point being that even the theoretical, the articulation of the theory of Plato's forms can also serve analogically as a way of understanding the kind of recognition that Socrates brings to bear in the discursion.
So it's kind of like so this is the mythos that my mind formed in understanding what you said. So I just got this vision of like, okay, I thou spoken as one word, right? Like it's not like
yeah,
right. So there's that kind of
yeah.
which thou that Socrates is, right? That you, if I'm Socrates and you're the I that thous, and something about the way I thou is given by because Socrates is in relationship to a greater thou,
right?
Who is I to a greater thou, right? That's so it's almost like Socrates is like a thou I.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean, and that's exactly it. I think yes.
Like a thou sandwich, right?
Yes. That. Well, it's the Janus face. That's Socrates' Janus face, right? His eye sees in both directions. Right. And that's why in Socrates the bidirectionality of the Socratic knowing is such that it couples the identities of knower and known, right? In the way of Gnosis.
Right.
Precisely because it's bidirectional in that manner.
Huh. Wow, this is really great. I feel really exercised.
I feel exercised too.
In a great way. I feel just very full of presence. The colors seem brighter.
Well, Guy, all the gyms and fitness centers in the world are closed right now, so this is what we have.
Totally. There you go. I'm not going to say so many cheesy things that went through my mind. Socrates,
I'm sure it's been done. I'm sure it's been said.
Yes. All right. So this is really great. I really, what's interesting is just in reading this, so the horizon of the dialogues, right, it's espousing a kind of desire to jump into them. So it's like, I think it's like I'm noticing if so much of Socrates, there's a lot about Socrates that people write about him as like a lover, like he's evoking an erotic desire for wisdom, right? And again, that goes through all these phases, right? But like that's its initial thing that he he evokes in one is the maddening love to want to love what is most wise.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing that as we're going through this paper, I'm just like the dialogues, the desire to read them is just becoming more articulate and more intense.
Yeah. It's what's really interesting too about Socrates and Eros is that in the dialogues, Socrates is both the subject and the object of Eros. Again, Socrates espouses transjectivity in more ways than one. Socrates is both the object of erotic desire at points in the dialogues, and then all the while the enviable subject of knowing and erotic desire, right? So we want to want the way Socrates wants, but we also want Socrates.
Yeah.
Right. And so that particular combination, I think, I think maybe I'll leave the comment there. That goes a long way to explaining how the role of how operative the role of Socrates is in this process.
Yeah.
And what it means for us.
Yeah.
As we partake of his.
And what I'm getting is
praxis.
it's not self-evident or obvious what Socrates is. Like,
no. Well, the process of trying to understand what Socrates is precisely the process of that trips us along this path in the first place.
So good.
Yeah.
So good. Awesome.
All right, so it's another one. Okay, great to talk to you, Guy, and until the next one then.
Yeah. Mwah.
All right, talk to you soon.